Indeed, Allah has purchased the wealth and souls of the believers in exchange for paradise. They fight in His cause, they kill and are killed, and that is the highest success. O you who believe, fight those who fight you.
I don't see Quran connected to killing. I don't see Quran connected to taking up lives. Quran is about existence, about tolerance, about mercy.
Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim.
The Quran has become the most ideologically influential text in the world. But what does the Quran actually say? And how much do Muslims and non-Muslims alike really understand about its message and its history? It's hard to imagine another time when this was such an urgent question. Orthodox Muslims believe that the Quran in its original Arabic is the perfect, timeless and unchanging word of God as first revealed to the Prophet Muhammad by the angel Gabriel in a cave in the Arabian desert nearly 1,500 years ago. God's message, according to Muslim belief, was transmitted bit by bit over a 23-year period until the death of the Prophet in the year 632. Muhammad, according to tradition, was illiterate, but his memory flawless. After each encounter with the archangel, he would repeat God's message to relatives and close friends who wrote it down on skins, palm leaves, anything that came to hand. Some 20 years after his death, these scraps were brought together in the first complete and written version of the Quran. To hear it recited is for most Muslims to experience the power of divine revelation as a shattering voice from the unseen.
This is God's word. God is present. God is there talking to you.
It feels that God is talking to me, to Lena, living in Cairo in 2007. Just like he was talking to Muhammad, living in Mecca.
It's talking to me, not to my intellect. It's talking to my body, it's talking to my heart.
It's a miracle from God. It's no ordinary book for many reasons. One is the sheer majesty of the language.
It's a very beautiful linguistic form. Sometimes it makes me cry.
I am in front of God. I am with Him. We are alone. He looks upon me. He can hear me. He speaks to me through the words of the Quran.
Muslims believe the Quran to be God's final revelation to mankind. It runs to just over 6,000 verses, roughly a fifth of the number in the Bible. But unlike the Gospels, which tell the story of Jesus, the Quran says virtually nothing about Muhammad's life.
Muhammad's life is mentioned very little if rare, in the Quran. More stories of Moses, Jesus, Abraham, Ishmael, Jacob, Noah, all the prophets of the Old and the New Testaments are mentioned in the Quran repeatedly. It is said that 2/3 of the Quran is devoted to the narratives of the Jewish people.
There's no obvious chronology. The Quran is a series of revelations organized in chapter form, with the narrative scattered seemingly randomly throughout the text.
The Quran doesn't conform to any comfortable existing human genre. It's not a history book, it's not a moralizing book, it's not a sermon, it's not a text of science, it's itself. There's no other text before or since that is remotely comparable to it.
Like earlier scriptures, the Quran uses parable, everyday language, to suggest that which is beyond our comprehension, the nature of God and the afterlife. Part prophecy, part exhortation, the Quran gives religious, political, legal and ethical guidelines.
True piety is this: to believe in God and the last day, the angels, the book and the prophet, to give of one's substance to kinsmen and orphans, the needy, the traveller, beggars, to free the slave, to perform the prayer and pay the alms.
If you're looking for an A to Z, you expect every aspect of life to be covered. It gives you parameters, and it leaves your intelligence and your own judgment to derive the details. So it's a book of guidelines.
Today, Islam is a religion of vast dimensions. Well over 1 billion people, from the Americas to China, from Finland to the southern tip of Africa, are Muslim. Yet within this single universe of belief, there are profound differences in the status of women, in attitudes to peace and violence, punishment and forgiveness. Some Muslim regimes deny girls the right to an education and women the right to vote or drive. In some countries, on public transport, women scuttle through the rear doors of segregated buses. In other Muslim countries, women lead political parties and even become heads of state. In some countries, executions by stoning, hanging and beheading are carried out in public. In other Muslim countries, nothing like this has been seen for centuries. There are also striking differences in religious practice and belief. At this mosque in the Iranian city of Qom, young men invoke the name of Imam Ali, the martyred son-in-law of the Prophet, who, they believe, receives their prayers and intercedes with God on their behalf. Other Muslims dismiss such practices as saint worship and blasphemy. In this Turkish mosque, Imam Ali, the martyred founder of the Shia community, looks down on devotees who spread a message of peace and harmony, not only between Muslim and Muslim, but between all those, Christian, Muslim and Jew, who share a belief in the one God. Here, men and women worship side by side and express their devotion in song and sometimes even in dance. Other followers of the same Quran consider this form of worship and the pictorial representation of Ali sacrilege. In this mosque, on the other side of the same city, men only pray with men. The opposite sex is considered a distraction, so women are screened from view. In some mosques, they are entirely excluded. As well as contrasts like these, there is a sense that the Muslim world is in a state of continuous change. This is Cairo in the 1970s. We could be in any large city in any Mediterranean country, not a veil in sight. This is Cairo today. There are very few Muslim women who would walk through streets like this unveiled. But if Islam is firmly rooted in the Koran, and the Koran is the ultimate and changeless message of God, how are these differences and changes possible?
وَإِنَّ الظَّالِمِينَ لَفِي شِقَاقٍ بَعِيدٍ وَلِيَعْلَمَ الَّذِينَ أُوتُوا الْعِلْمَ أَنَّهُ الْحَقُّ.
Paradoxically, part of the answer is in the language itself. The Quran is written in a form of classical Arabic, which is often difficult even for highly educated speakers of Arabic to understand.
وَلَا يَزَالُ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا فِي مِرْيَةٍ.
For most Muslims, Arabic is not their first language, and no translation, so we are told, can capture the full meaning of the original. As a result, the individual imam or preacher becomes the intermediary between the Quran and the message his followers receive. That message can be tailored to fit the time and place. And over the centuries, interpretations and additions have filled hundreds of thousands of volumes. There's the Hadith, the collected sayings and deeds of the Prophet, the scholarly commentaries, and the Sharia, the Islamic legal system based on the Quran and the Hadith. Most Muslims argue that the Quran cannot stand alone, but must be read in conjunction with the Hadith. Others disagree.
The Hadith were all compiled and collected some 250 to 350 years after the death of the Prophet. Many of them are forged or fabricated and have been called into question. Unfortunately, however, many Muslims consider the Hadith to be co-equal with the Quran. But clearly that is not so. The Quran makes quite clear that it is the ultimate text. Anything else cannot be on the same level.
So what does the Quran itself say about some of the most challenging issues today? Is it possible to go directly to the source and discover God's message to mankind? We shall be examining what the Quran has to say about the role and conduct of women.
If the veil is worn, it must cover the face and hide the beauty.
We'll learn what the Quran has to say about crime and punishment.
The main objective of the Sharia is forgiveness. Is to be forgiven, is not just to judge and to kill.
We'll consider what the Quran has to say about conflict.
The message of the Quran is clear. If anyone attacks you, attack him in like manner.
We shall hear from people who even raise questions about the text itself.
In order to understand it correctly, we need a fundamentally new interpretation and reading of the Quran.
The Christian Orthodox convent of Sidoniah was founded in Syria in 547, some 20 years before the birth of the Prophet Muhammad, and it has been respected and protected in the heart of the Muslim world for nearly 15 centuries. The convent is dedicated to Mary, the mother of Jesus. Sidoniah means Our Lady in Aramaic, the language of the whole Middle East at the time of Christ. Arabic is now the language of these Christian devotions. God is Allah, and anyone familiar with the Quran will recognize words and phrases in the sung liturgy. The nuns of Cyrenaica are guardians of a relic so sacred that no one is permitted to see it. Locked away behind a series of silver doors is an icon of Mary holding the infant Jesus. It is said they both sat for the portrait, which was painted by St. Luke. Whatever the truth, Christians and Muslims, like these women, come here to pray to the Madonna for miracles of healing.
I came with my husband here to the church and asked Madonna to give me a baby.
Mary in Islam and the Quran is regarded as the highest and the most chaste and virtuous woman ever. A woman who brought a miracle on the face of this earth, a birth of a baby, even though she was virgin. But of course, God does not need to be the father of the baby. That's the difference in the Islamic narrative.
An entire chapter of the Quran is named after Mary. Abraham, Moses, David, and the prophets of the Torah are also revered, as is Jesus. Though not considered the Son of God, he is mentioned more times by name in the Quran than Muhammad himself.
Jesus is a very revered figure. He is also considered a prophet who brought one of the holy scriptures that we also believe in. In Islam, it's known as Injil. It's now known as, of course, the New Testament.
All the biblical prophets, all the holy books which were revealed before the Quran, before Prophet Muhammad, are authentic, are true. In order to be a good Muslim, you have to accept this fact.
I believe in Moses and I believe in the Torah. Would that make me a Jew? If I believe in Jesus and the Bible, that make me Christian. And I believe in Muhammad and the Quran, that make me Muslim. Jesus and Moses and Muhammad, they are the same level of prophecy. They are ulil azm. You know, they are mentioned in the Quran as they are messengers from God. So who we are to say this is better than the others and this is right and this is wrong? Lakum dinukum waliya din. You have your religion, I have mine. God says. These are not my words.
And there are many other verses in the same vein. Muslims, Jews, and Christians are described as the people of the book.
Those who are Jews and Christians, their reward is with the Lord.
There is no compulsion in religion.
But then, a contradiction. Other verses warn Muslims not to follow the errant views of Christians and Jews, nor to take them as their friends. Tolerance and intolerance apparently in equal measure. And so it is with messages of peace and violence.
Whoever killeth a human being, it shall be as if he hath killed all mankind. And whosoever saveth the life of one, it shall be as if he'd saved all mankind.
But then in the very next verse,
the only reward of those who make war upon Allah and His Messenger and strive after corruption in the land will be that they will be killed or crucified, or have their hands and feet on alternate sides cut off. Such will be their degradation in the world and in the hereafter. Theirs will be an awful doom.
How are these contradictions to be understood?
Well, they're not differences or contradictions in any way. They're describing two different phenomena. One is a peacetime rule and the other is wartime rule. When the Muslims were living in Medina and the local Jewish tribe broke the treaty that they signed and declared war and enmity, when some of the Christian tribes allied with them, the verse was, don't take them as your protectors, for certainly they have betrayed the trust and the treaty that you mutually have signed.
Other Muslims see the alternate paths as God's gift to mankind of free will.
The Quran is like a big store, like a big supermarket. In this book, you are able to pick different answers. You are able to make peace according to the Quran. You are able to declare war according to the Quran. So many different voices come out of the Quran. Moderate people have their support in the verses of the Quran. Radical people have the same thing with different verses in the Quran.
Peace and violence, tolerance and intolerance, opposing themes throughout the Quran and Islamic history. First, there was conquest. Under Muhammad's leadership and after his death in 632, Arab armies fanned out in all directions. To the north and east, they defeated the armies of Byzantium and Persia, claiming Syria, Palestine, Iran and Iraq for Islam. To the west, they conquered Egypt and swept across North Africa, reaching the Atlantic coast by the 680s. As the desert warriors defeated these great civilizations, they chose not to raze and destroy, but to learn and build upon what was already there. Some of the greatest Islamic architecture in the world was created less than 80 years after the Prophet's death.
The Quran is the initial detonation that launches one of the most extraordinary civilizational stories of human experience. Within 100 years, the barefoot warriors of Western Arabia were masters of a great, sophisticated, hugely prosperous civilization that stretched from the beaches of Morocco across to the gates of China. And really the force that produced that was this amazing, radioactive, glorious piece of thunder in their hands, which was the Word of God, the uncreated Word of God.
And when the tables were turned and successive waves of invaders from the east seized control of the Muslim world from the Arabs, they soon submitted to the faith of the people they had conquered. Fired by this glorious piece of thunder, each new dynasty saw astounding developments in architecture, science and philosophy, while Europe remained mired in its feudal dark ages.
There's something which is very important in the Quran, which is asking the Muslim, go and just seek for knowledge, look for knowledge, try to understand. So go in the world and try to understand.
The ideas of the ancient Greeks and Romans might never have reached us had it not been for Islamic scholars and scientists who rediscovered, developed and enriched them. And that stimulus came from the Quran, which in verse after verse calls upon mankind to examine the heavens and the earth, to reflect on creation, to look and look again. As early as the 9th century, Muslim scientists calculated the circumference of the earth, while medieval Europe hung grimly to the notion of a flat earth. Arabic numerals were developed from their Indian origins into the basis of a new arithmetic. Trigonometry, algebra and geometry were wholly or largely Muslim inventions. Islamic medicine remains standard practice for 1,000 years. When Muslim society was in the ascendancy, the values of freedom and tolerance it took from the Quran encouraged persecuted Jews and dissident Christians to flee Europe and seek the protection of Islam. But when the Muslim world felt threatened, either by external enemies or internal disruption, the impulse was to close in and take a very different message from the Quran. In the minds of many Muslims, we are now living in such a time. Jaffa Street, Jerusalem, August 2001. 87 wounded, 18 killed. Amongst the dead, 6 children. Yet more numbers added to the ghastly death toll of non-combatants on either side. In just the last 8 years, over 700 Israelis, over 2,000 Palestinians. It's a shattering thought, but the conclusions you draw from scenes like these depend entirely on who you are.
You have this challenge to ask yourself what you know about us. You all the time have these sensations through the media. We are the killers, we are the terrorists, we are those who make troubles all over the world. It's not true. Sometimes you have to think that we are also the victims of this reality.
All a question of perception. For Israelis, security fences to protect them in their reclaimed biblical homeland from the horror of rocket attacks and suicide bombers. For displaced Palestinians, concrete walls to entrap them and make life here on the West Bank intolerable. Whatever you choose to call them, these are the greatest barriers ever created between two peoples of the book. For this is Holy Land for Muslims too, referred to in several verses in the Koran.
The Palestine-Israel dispute is the thorn in everyone's heart in the Muslim and Arab world, because it's the longest occupation in modern times. It's creating the indifference, it's creating the clash of civilizations, it's seeding in more and more hatred. The longer the occupation, the more hatred we have.
But it is the religious dimension, as much as the fate of Palestinians, that sets crowds like these marching in demonstrations, sometimes spontaneous and sometimes orchestrated, in cities across the Muslim world. Jerusalem, Al-Quds in Arabic, is sacred to Jews, Christians and Muslims. Devout Jews pray at the Western Wall, the last remnant of the Second Temple destroyed by the Romans in the year 70 AD, a date that marks the start of the long night of the Jewish diaspora. On the mount above, 2 mosques, Al-Aqsa and the Dome on the Rock, built 6 centuries later when the victorious Arabs wrested control of the city from Christian Byzantium. According to biblical tradition, the rock beneath the dome is where Abraham made ready to sacrifice his son Isaac, and according to the Koran, it was also from here that Muhammad ascended into heaven following a night journey from Mecca to Jerusalem.
People must understand, Jerusalem is the 3rd city for us after Mecca and Al-Madinah. In the early days, the Prophet and his companions used to face Jerusalem when they prayed, until they received God's instruction through the Quran to face Mecca. God elevated our Prophet from Mecca to Jerusalem and then called him to the heavens, so it is the gate to heaven, and we can't abandon any part of it, no matter how weak we are, how strong they are.
Since the early Middle Ages, Islam respected the rights of Christians and Jews to worship here freely. But in modern times, that contract has been broken. Under British and then Jordanian rule, Jewish access was severely restricted until the Israeli armies seized control of the old city in 1967. Now it's the Palestinians, trapped in their Gaza enclave and no longer free to worship here, while those from the West Bank can be held at checkpoints for hours until the opportunity for worship has passed.
Enough is enough. Enough for bloodshed, enough for killing, enough for hatred. Because we belong to the same family. We worship the same God. Even in Jerusalem here, and Hebron, and Shechem, Nablus, all these places are holy places for Muslims and non-Muslims, for Muslims and Jews. Sometimes, like in Hebron, they share the same room.
In the West Bank city of Hebron, the tomb of Abraham, father to the Jewish and Arab nations through his sons Isaac and Ishmael. As clearly stated in the Koran, God himself chose Abraham for his friend and commanded Muhammad, Abraham, Moses and Jesus, be not divided. But Hebron is as fiercely divided as any city on earth. Abraham's tomb is on the front line between Palestinians and Jewish settlers and is guarded like a fortress.
Close it. In order to maintain the sanctity of these places, we have to work together to redevelop the same beautiful things we have in the medieval times. This small territory belongs to all of us.
But it's an appeal that goes unheard. For this is a place of bitter memories, from the days and nights of terror nearly 80 years ago, when 67 Jews were murdered here, to the 1994 massacre of 29 Arabs in the Shrine of the Patriarch at the hands of a Jewish extremist.
We have to ask ourselves how it could be better for all of us, how we are able to rebuild the reality in a different way, far from hatred, far from bloodshed, far from war, to give the sense of security, to give the sense of trust between ourselves.
But when trust and mutual respect break down, the hard men on both sides reach into their sacred texts for the messages they need to hear. Sheikh Tafesh of Hamas was elected to represent Bethlehem with nearly a third of the votes coming from Christian Palestinians.
Right needs power to protect it, especially when your land and your people have been attacked. Flowers sometimes need the protection of thorns. The message of the Quran is clear. If anyone attacks you, attack him in like manner. If they kill our women, children and elderly as they have in our cities and villages, we will retaliate in kind.
But suicide is specifically forbidden in the Quran.
That's true. God said, do not kill yourselves and do not bring misery upon yourself. So we are forbidden from attempting suicide. If we had the same weapons as the enemy, we would not resort to this method, but we don't, so it's our only option.
But when the violence spreads beyond the Palestinian struggle, 9/11, 7/7 in Britain with thousands of victims, including Muslims.
The same issue. What does America plant in the world? It is guilty of great injustices against ordinary people. It attacks them. And the same goes for Britain, which occupied many Arab and Muslim countries. In all that time, how many people did Britain murder and execute?
And here in Iran, as elsewhere in the Muslim world, the anger goes beyond Palestine, which is seen as one dark chapter in a long history of humiliation at the hands of the Christian West and its allies. These are people with a powerful narrative, which may be inaccurate and distorted, but is sustained by a real sense of injustice and vivid flashes of inherited memory. It speaks of a time when Imperial France and Britain carved up the Middle East between them, imposing Western law, Western values, even Western dress. It's a narrative of oil wealth stolen, of corrupt presidents and kings sustained by the West against the will of their own peoples and toppled when their usefulness had passed. And the closer we get to the present, the harsher and more painful the narrative becomes. Defeat after defeat at the hands of the West and its clients. and in the final chapter, Afghanistan and again Iraq. Not seen as any kind of liberation, but as occupation and utter humiliation. No one makes more capital out of this narrative than the hard-line clerics of fundamentalist Islam.
All the bloodshed these days is the blood of Muslims. Chechnya is Muslim blood. Kashmir is Muslim blood. Afghanistan is Muslim blood. Bosnia and Herzegovina is Muslim blood. Palestine is Muslim blood. Cyprus is Muslim blood. Ethiopia is Muslim blood. And Somalia is Muslim blood. We almost covered the map.
And as the anger rises and the tone hardens, the voices of those to whom the Quran speaks of peace and tolerance are drowned out by those who take the contradictory message.
And we have to declare that we are the children of the Emir of believers, Imam Ali. And wherever we are, we will stand up against the enemies of Islam. We will never surrender to these crooked people. Never. Oh God, cut off the wicked hands of America and Israel. Make America, Israel and Britain weak.
Yet amidst all this talk against the external enemy, one awkward fact stands out. Over the centuries, more Muslims have been killed by their fellow Muslims than have died at the hands of Christians and Jews. In Part 3, we try to understand the passions and convictions that separate people who claim to believe word for word in the same Quran. Slaughter and destruction. Shia against Sunni, Sunni against Shia. Who are these people? And what's at the heart of the conflict? Is it the different ways these warring groups read the Quran? Diversity of tongues and colors is, in the words of the Quran, among the wonders of God's creation. Allah has no preference for any race, tribe, or nation above another, and is no respecter of human ideas of class and status. The best in His sight is the most honorable. It is a message that gives dignity to the poorest laborer or peasant who has no need of priests or rabbis to interpret God's message because, as it says in the Quran, we have made this easy to understand in your own tongue. Any shed, field, or street corner is a suitable place to worship Him, and He is always close to you. Closer, God says in the Quran, than your jugular vein. And when you pray, you feel you're speaking directly to Him.
Prayer gives you a feeling that no one can describe. It's beyond human imagination. You feel you're in God's hands, in the hands of someone you love. You're not praying because you have to, or because you're frightened of Him. You're praying because you feel such love for Him.
Whether prayer is private or communal, the idea that everyone has a direct personal relationship with God is at the heart of the message of the Quran and Sunni Muslim belief. And the Sunnis are the majority, roughly 85% of the worldwide Muslim community. But the God the Sunni worship may not be described in human language, nor represented in any art form, for that would be blasphemous. Yet sometimes the human heart yearns for more. For a faith you can touch and feel. For drama, for music, for ceremony, for great stories of sacrifice, pain, martyrdom, and salvation. And for someone to pray to who has human form. Shia Islam answers these needs. In the Iranian city of Qom, they're commemorating the murder of Ali, son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad. The Shia revere Ali and his descendants as the Imams, following the bloodline of the Prophet. Down the generations, one Imam after another was murdered, until the 12th and last Imam, who disappeared in childhood and will return as the Mahdi, the Shia Messiah, to establish a perfect society on earth. But do these specific beliefs have any substance in the Quran? The answer is no. But from the earliest days of Islam until the 19th century, the Shia accused the Sunni of tahrif, falsification of the Quran, by altering key words which make it clear that God had chosen Ali and his descendants to succeed Muhammad as leaders of the Muslim community. But in today's atmosphere, any talk of a falsified Quran is out of the question.
There has been no alteration and manipulation in the Quran that Muslims have today. All the Qurans that Muslims are reading right across the world are identical.
The Quran that all Muslims read makes clear the direct personal relationship between man and God. But Shia Muslims believe there's an intermediary. The Iranian city of Mashhad, built around the magnificent shrine to Imam al-Reza, the 8th Imam, who was poisoned in the year 818. As they cross the street, people pause to honor the sacred memory of this departed saint. Shia pilgrims come to Mashhad from all over the world with gifts and donations and to pray to Imam al-Reza in the same way that Roman Catholics and Orthodox Christians pray to their saints for help, guidance and miracles of healing.
All Iranians fervently believe in our Imams because they have the power to cure, because they are forgiving, they are full of goodness. We have complete faith in our Imams and their descendants, all of them.
If there's a time when your heart is broken and you bring your problems to Imam Reza, he will hear your prayer. He can unburden your heart and lift your spirits.
But the Quran makes it so clear that your prayer should only be directed to God.
When you want to reach God, you have to speak to the Imams first so that they can mediate for you. And if you do it that way, God will give you a quicker answer to your request. At least, that's how it's been explained to us.
Imam Reza and the other Imams are our only hope.
Sentiments like these seem completely contrary to the Quranic ideal of a direct, personal relationship with God.
When Muslims pray at the tombs of departed saints, they are compromising this strict tenet of Islam. The Quran says clearly it's a sin, because this Imam Reza, he was a great man, but he's dead. The dead cannot help you. Only God is ever living.
I don't say that I go to Imam Reza so that he can solve my problems. I say that I have a request for God, but my position is not high enough to reach him. I put Imam Reza as the intermediary so that he, who is very dear to God, asks him to have mercy on me.
The Grand Ayatollah addresses us from his private office in the heart of the Iranian city of Qom. Here especially, one gets a sense of how the differences between Shia and Sunni echo the Catholic-Protestant divide. With its grand ayatollahs, its lesser ayatollahs, its jurist consuls and mullahs, its mosques and seminaries, the holy city of Qom is, in so many respects, a Shia Vatican. People come here to pay their tithes and seek answers to questions they can't resolve through their own reading of the Koran. And Grand Ayatollah Saneh is ready to receive his daily quotas of written petitions. First, a marriage problem.
This husband entered the marriage concealing the fact that he was infertile and incapable of having children. If his wife had known of his condition, the marriage would never have taken place. In view of this, can she annul the marriage and ask for a divorce?
Yes, she can annul the marriage. Infertility is not in itself an impediment to marriage, but this is a case of deception, because the marriage contract was based on the assumption of health.
The same principle applies when virginity is in question.
Yes, that's right. Am I correct, Mr. Hai?
But Mr. Hai questions whether it's fair to assume deception. In his view, the problem may only have come to light after the marriage. But the Grand Ayatollah disagrees.
He has concealed this imperfection. That's clear to me. It's a definite case of deception.
The Quran is totally against any kind of priesthood. In chapter 9, verse 31, it says quite categorically, talking about the Jews and the Christians, that one of their problems was that they'd taken their rabbis, their monks, their priests as lords besides God. We do not require intermediaries. There's no need for an intercessor. You and I have the absolute right to pray and to connect with the divine.
Sunni and Shia, then, are fundamentally divided in their relationship with God and the Quran. And there are further divisions within both traditions. And one important movement that has followers across the divide: the Sufis. The Sufis need no intermediaries to interpret the Quran for them. It speaks directly to their hearts.
Quran is so simple. God didn't make it very complicated. It's your daily life stories. You don't need scholars to understand it. Look at the Indian people from India. They don't speak Arabic. Look at the Turkish people. They don't speak Arabic. Persian, they don't speak Arabic. They memorized the Quran. As soon as they memorized and they understood it, it entered to the heart without translation.
The Sufis believe their relationship with God is also direct. And above all, it is a relationship of all-consuming love.
You say Allah, it just brings you that feeling, that passion, love. You are connected with the one you love. You have to carve God's name in your heart, like you carve on stones. But you can't carve God's name on your heart by chisels and hammer. You carve it by repeating the name, always repeating the name. So when you say Allah, it has to come from the heart, deep. It's not just word comes out of the mouth.
Among the Mehlevi Sufis here in Istanbul, that passion, that love for the divine, is expressed through music and dance. It's a 700-year-old ritual heavy with symbolism. Black cloaks representing the grave, high brown caps, the tombstone. And the dance itself, quickening and quickening, a mystical journey of love deepening and the ego vanishing as the devotee comes closer and closer to the divine. The Mehlevi believe that this dance is represented in the Quran by the swirling patterns worked into so many early versions of the text, and is directly connected to the central ritual of Islam, the mass circulation around the holy Kaaba in Mecca. But the people who control Mecca today would regard every religious practice of the Mehlevi Sufis, the music, the dance, the easy informal mixing of men and women, as abominations. The men who walk with King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia are Sunni Muslims, but they've moved a long way from the Sunni ideal of a direct personal relationship with God. Saudi Arabia has its own clerical hierarchy, and the dominant religious message here is a belligerent and patriarchal Islam known as Wahhabism.
على الزوجة في الإسلام أن تلبي رغبة زوجها في الفراق. الله يعلم حاجة الرجل، ولذلك أمر المرأة أن تجيب زوجها ولو كانت على التنور.
من وجدتموه يعمل عمل قوم لوط فاقتلوا الفاعل والمفعول. رجلين يضربان بالسيف ثم يوضعان على نعش ويحرق النعش.
الحقيقة أن الجهاد الذي وقع في الفلوجة يرفع الرأس وتضرب رقاب وتنسف جماجم. هذا خط النصر والشهادة والتضحية.
By controlling the theological heart of Islam, as well being flushed with petrodollars, they've been able to impose their strict, rigid, narrow, sectarian, divisive interpretation of Islam on the whole Muslim community, international community. And this has been a tremendous tragedy for all of us.
Over the past 20 years or so, it has been argued that over $100 billion has been expended by the Saudi government in propagating their version of Islam across the world. New mosques, madrasas, Muslim teachers, imams, school textbooks, literature have all been shaped by a Wahhabi agenda, a modern agenda, an ideology which is deeply rooted in a puritanical form of Islam.
The King Fahd printing press in Medina, Saudi Arabia has the capacity to publish 10 million Qurans a year in Arabic and 44 other languages. These are distributed around the world, well below cost and in some cases for free. And it's fascinating to see how the Saudi religious establishment has augmented the text. Into the verse that speaks of those who have earned God's anger and gone astray, they have inserted in brackets, such as the Jews and such as the Christians. In verse 569, the Quran assures righteous Jews and Christians that no fear should come upon them. The Saudi footnote insists that this was abrogated, cancelled, by a later verse claiming that those of any religion other than Islam will never be accepted. And into the verse calling upon the faithful to make their armaments ready against the enemies of Islam, the translator has made another insertion: tanks, planes, missiles and artillery. Saudi Arabia, with its massive oil wealth, has been one of the major influences driving the Muslim world towards fundamentalism and an intolerant reading of the Quran.
One of the great tragedies of the current Islamic political landscape is that the only two states that are concerned to use their resources to promote a particular vision of Islam internationally are the Iranians and the Saudis, neither of whom represent a kind of mainstream, classical, inclusive Islam of the kind that most Muslims know and are familiar with and love.
Though the Iranian Shiites are on the opposite side of the religious divide, they have one thing in common with the Saudis: a priestly caste contrary to the spirit of the Quran.
For many centuries, during the golden ages of Islam, no one had religion as a profession. Even the scholars of religion had other professions. Today, unfortunately, there are those who have adopted religion as a profession and are making money out of religion, and they have a huge vested interest in a huge following, in a large following, and will use every tool. They will use television, they will use all kinds of media, and monopolize religion. This is against the essence of Islam.
One of the worst consequences of this transformation has been the massive increase in public executions, floggings and hangings in those countries where the religious establishment exercises political power. Iran now executes more people as a percentage of the population than any country on earth, even surpassing China. How can you justify so many executions?
I believe that Islam's law of retaliation in kind for murderers is one of the most beautiful laws of the Quran. If we want to choose only one good law from the Quran, it's that one. Killing a murderer is not even execution, it's retaliation in kind.
But it's not just murderers who are killed in this country. Homosexuals are put to death. People are executed even for possessing alcohol.
If the government decides that by killing them it can restore security, it's allowed to do so. This is very rare, but I believe people support it in Islam and probably in the world. I hope in the future this becomes law not only in the Islamic Republic of Iran, but in the entire world of Islam.
But does the Quran really justify any of this? What does it say about crime and punishment?
As for the thief, both male and female, cut off their hands. It is the reward of their own deeds, an exemplary punishment from Allah. Allah is mighty, wise. But whosoever repenteth after his wrongdoing and amendeth, Allah will relent toward him. Allah is forgiving, merciful.
All through the Quran, it is made absolutely clear that if the offender sincerely repents, the punishment cannot be carried out. And this emphasis on mercy is so often ignored by those who mete out justice according to their reading of the Quran.
The adulterer and the adulteress, scourge ye each one of them with 100 stripes. Let not pity for the twain withhold you from obedience to Allah.
And if they repent and improve, let them be. Allah is ever relenting, merciful.
And in that spirit, the Quran is absolutely clear that no one must be convicted without conclusive proof of guilt.
The main objective of the Sharia is forgiveness. Is to be forgiven, is not just to judge and to kill. And then the conditions to implement the penal code are so high that all the scholars were saying from the very beginning, it's quite impossible to implement them.
The crime of adultery, for example, demands that 4 witnesses testify to the sexual act. That makes it actually impossible for there to be evidentiary proof of adultery. That's why, since the inception of Islam until now, the number of times that adulterers have received the full punishment can be counted on the fingers of one hand, and the same goes for amputation. Before sentence can be carried out, every possible reason for mitigation must be considered.
This is how Sharia law is interpreted and practiced here on the Palestinian West Bank. Next door to the main fruit market in the town of Ramallah is the very unforbidding Sharia court. The atmosphere inside is wonderfully casual. No policemen, no handcuffed prisoners, just an endless stream of people, some on official business, others just stopping by for a chat. As in most Muslim countries, there are 2 legal systems. Civil law, often a hybrid of Islamic, Napoleonic and Roman law, applied in criminal cases, and Sharia law dealing with personal and family matters. The Sharia judges adjudicate in custody disputes and divorce cases where the woman's entitlement is based on principles laid down in the Quran. The elderly have the right to appeal to the courts if they can show they're being neglected by sons and daughters who have the resources to help them. The court also has a duty to appoint guardians for orphans and the mentally impaired. Here, the judge poses a set of simple questions to test the mental competence of an elderly woman who has recently lost her son. Under Islamic law, the mother is entitled to a proportion of her son's estate if he predeceases her. But the judge decides that the old lady is not competent to handle her finances and appoints her daughter-in-law to act on her behalf. This is the law based on Quranic principles as practiced here, but quite unlike the understanding of Sharia that most people have in the West. And where else might impressions be distorted or one-sided? In Part 4, we look at the huge contrasts in the treatment of women across the Muslim world and try to discover what the Quran actually says about a woman's rights and status. We're in a nightclub in Cairo, not a veil in sight. Men and women mixing freely, and everything here perfectly permissible within the laws of this Muslim country. But few women here would venture into the streets outside dressed like this. There's no law that requires it, but a powerful consensus that women should be veiled. In other parts of the Muslim world, the veil is obligatory. The women here in Iran are uniformly dressed in chadors, which cover their hair and all their outer clothing, leaving only the face and hands exposed. In places like Saudi Arabia, full coverage, including face and hands, is mandatory, while in Muslim Turkey, wearing the veil at all is a contentious issue, and the ground rules are changing all the time.
When I walk down the streets of Cairo unveiled, I do feel a certain pressure. I don't look like everyone else. It attracts attention, and some of it is negative. 3 decades ago, the hijab did not exist in Egypt. Up until 1974, I had not seen a single veiled woman. If you look at the Nasser funeral in September 1970, 7 million Egyptian men and women were on the streets of Cairo. You will not spot one veiled woman.
Nasser's funeral was also a turning point. The dream of Arab nations united under him in a secular socialist utopia had been destroyed by military defeat and economic failure. People had to find a new identity.
Suddenly, we did not have much to hang on to. We had to find something else. And many young people who were born in the 70s were the first to run for the religious identity.
But what does the Quran actually say about the woman's obligation to wear the veil? One particular verse is usually singled out.
Tell the female believers to restrain their eyes and guard their virginity, and not display their adornment, except for what is apparent, and draw their veils over their cleavage, and to not display their beauty.
And not to display their adornment except for that which is apparent. In search of the correct interpretation, we began with one of the highest Islamic authorities in the world.
ولا يبدين زينتهن إلا ما ظهر منها
Most clerics agree that which is apparent means the hands and the face.
The men of religion had wives and daughters who were not in the hijab until the 70s. So have they suddenly realized that it is required?
And that's not the only paradox. Other scholars interpret the same verse in the Quran as a clear injunction that a woman's face should be covered.
The Quran has clearly stipulated women's dress code in Surah Al-Nur. It states that the face, eyes, lips and womanly beauty are their adornments. If the veil is worn, it must cover the face and hide the beauty.
I have read the Quran many times. I have read the Hadith. I have read interpretations of the Quran, and it is my personal belief that I am not required to wear the hijab. And 15 years ago, I could have engaged in a discussion with men of religion over that. Today, it is almost impossible to engage in a discussion of that detail. If you say that, it is blasphemous.
Their face should not be covered. It is not an Islamic duty. It is not a Quranic injunction. It predates Islam and predates Prophet Muhammad's own life. It was a normal Bedouin custom of the society. So in a nutshell, Muslim women are to cover whole of their body except their face and their hands.
Even if it isn't a direct order from God, it preserves a woman's chastity. It protects her from stares and from any person who might abuse her.
7 a.m. in their Cairo apartment. Anan Kamal and her husband Mustafa are getting their children ready for school. In one sense, this is everyday reality. In another, it is not. Our presence forces Hanan to wear the niqab, as she now believes she must in the presence of any male outside her immediate family. Until her engagement to Mustafa, who works as a chauffeur, Hanan was a practicing lawyer. Once married, she gave up her practice, assumed the niqab, and dedicated herself to raising a family and maintaining the home. She says that Mustafa had no influence on the decision. It was God who called her to wear the niqab.
Humans don't control what happens to them. It is God who directs us.
Has Allah rewarded you for your devotion?
Yes, definitely, thanks be to God. I was quite nervous about taking this step. I felt the niqab would be a restriction on me. I was really taking this step with fear. I felt I might relapse at any time. But with God's help, it was probably the time I felt most relaxed and comfortable in my home, with my husband and children. Once I put on the niqab, I came closer to God.
Our facial expressions are like another language. They're an important part of the way we communicate with people. It seems to me that covering the face is like cutting out one's tongue, taking away a form of communication.
No, of course not. God knows that the woman is a gem, so he hides it and preserves it, and doesn't show it except to close family and her husband, for whose sake she was created. I'm talking now, aren't I? And do you understand what I'm saying? Talking is about feelings, not just facial expressions. Feelings from the heart. No, this talk is completely groundless.
You gave up a good career to be a homemaker and wear the niqab. Wasn't that a huge financial sacrifice as well as a personal sacrifice?
Anyone who gives to God is fully compensated. I didn't feel any loss at all. On the contrary, my husband got a better job and my life became so much better when I dedicated myself to my children and my husband, and of course deepened my relationship with God.
The veil is a complex symbol with many meanings for Muslim women. To those like Hanan who choose to wear the niqab, it signals complete subjection to God and husband and withdrawal from the world. For other women, it is worn in the world as a proud statement of who they are.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm a very proud Muslim woman. I'm proud of my identity. I'm proud of my veil. I'm proud of what it stands for.
Lina Fawzi runs a training program in rural Egypt. A university graduate who's travelled widely, she's clearly accepted as a figure of authority by this largely male group. 5 years ago, at the age of 26, Lina was divorced. Almost immediately, she decided to wear the hijab.
I remember the first time I went out wearing the veil, and I remember feeling this is how God wants to honor a woman. This is the respect a woman demands by wearing the veil. And I felt very dignified and very honored by it.
Since her divorce, Lina has gone back to live with her parents. Her closest friends are young women like herself, university graduates, privileged, widely travelled, and absolutely committed to the same cause. To her parents' generation, this whole trend is baffling.
Lina did it just one Friday morning like that. I was amazed. Just one Friday morning.
Saturday, actually.
Saturday, was it? Yeah. And she just put on the hijab, came out of her room, and she said, okay, here I am, I'm muhajjaba. To be honest with you, I wasn't very happy. I wasn't very happy at all. Because I don't think that the hair of a woman is something that she has to hide. This is what I believe. Because I feel my hair is like my flesh.
One verse in the Quran says that Muslim women should hide, should not show their natural beauty, natural adornment, except that which appears from it. And there's a whole controversy around that. What appears from it? Is it the face? Is it the hands? Is it the eyes? Is it the hair? And lots of people have said different things about that.
It is not a verse in the Quran. I feel maybe many, Al-Azhar maybe will be mad at me if I say so, but God could have said, cover your hair. It wasn't mentioned. It was mentioned for the wives of the Prophet.
Personally, there's no way I could deny that my hair was part of my natural beauty. In my heart, I felt that that was part of what God had asked me to cover up as a Muslim woman.
But people understand or interpret the Quran in different ways, and we are lucky that Prophet gave us a concession that everyone should really consult his heart. And it depends on how people are convinced.
Do the ambiguities and apparent contradictions in the Quran trouble you?
Well, the short answer is no. I question a lot of things, but I feel very, very comfortable accepting that if there's something that I feel is not right with the Quran, then the problem is with my understanding, not with the Quran. Having said that, the Quran is constantly enjoining us to reflect, to question, to understand, to use our mental faculties, to use our heart and understanding.
As you read it, you don't feel the Quran relegates women to an inferior status?
Not at all.
Really?
If there is any disempowerment to women in this part of the world, it's entirely cultural. It's nothing to do with religion. The Quran honors women. The Quran dignifies women. I feel that as a woman every day.
Men and women entirely equal in Islam? Any disparities cultural, nothing to do with Islam? Let's hear some of those verses from the Quran. Men are the managers of women's affairs in that God has preferred one over the other.
Meaning that the man is financially responsible for the family and supplying all their needs.
Men are a degree above women.
But the woman is equal to the man in everything that touches human feelings: love, trust, confidence, pride, respect and honor.
Those wives you fear may be rebellious, admonish, banish to their couches and beat them.
الإسلام حينما قال بالضرب في القرآن جعله
Islam says through the Quran that beating is appropriate for a certain type of woman. Not all women.
ليست كل امرأة. المرأة التي
This teaching applies to the woman who disobeys her husband and refuses to live in her house and refuses to raise her children and wants to go out whenever she pleases and wants no one to control her and is unwilling to fulfill her duties.
لا أحد يتحكم فيها ولا تقوم بدورها.
Your wives are land to be tilled, so till your land when and how you will.
أن المرأة ليست متاع.
This is an honouring of women. Women are not the property of a man. They are like the fertile land that a husband takes care of and doesn't exhaust.
It's not an easy task reconciling verses from the Quran with modern notions of equality and human rights. But Dr. Salah has taken it on. A weekly TV show, Women's Fatwas, is seen by women across the Arab world.
My duty as a broadcaster and an academic is to show the true face of Islam and the correct interpretation of the Quran and the traditions of the Prophet. The issue of the veil, polygamy, divorce, the beating of women, the non-participation of women in political life, depriving the woman of her financial property and private property, forcing women into marriage, in some countries to marry someone she doesn't love because he's from the same tribe. All these are bad practices and are results of traditions and cultures not connected to Islam. These are throwbacks to pre-Islamic times.
Dr. Salah is the first woman dean of Al-Azhar University, the most prestigious in the Muslim world. For daring to suggest that the Quran respects men and women equally, she has faced death threats. Yet many Muslims share her views.
If you look at both the letter and the spirit of the Quran, there are innumerable verses that talks about the parity, the egalitarian nature between the genders. For example, in Surah Baqarah, chapter 2, 187, the Quran says, talking about women, they are a garment to you as you are a garment to them.
I think that's the most incredible verse about the relationship between a husband and a wife. The closeness, the warmth that, the clothes provide. Clothes conceal your faults, they beautify you. And that's what the marriage relationship is. You're so close. You can't get a more beautiful image than that. And nobody ever mentions that.
Other interpretations are less comforting. Pakistan. Women protest honor killing, murder committed by Muslim men who believe their religion requires them to take the life of any female relative who disobeys them by following her heart. And this? Little girls subject to circumcision, genital mutilation. In Egypt, 97% of girls aged 15 to 19 have endured this in some form or other.
Circumcision has existed from the time of the Prophet of God and has been organized by the Prophet himself.
The Quran does not say anything about female genital mutilation. It is a tradition that has unfortunately existed in this country for centuries.
Although there's no endorsement in the Koran, some hardline clerics strongly support the practice.
Circumcision is the reason why Muslim women are virtuous, unlike Western women who run after their sexual appetite in any place with any man. I hope I don't insult or embarrass the English nation, where adultery occurs on a large scale. With circumcision, it would refine, rectify, purify.
It is an African cultural practice predating Islam, and undoubtedly, as far as the ijma, consensus amongst the scholars of the world of today is concerned, it harms a female body, it's mutilating a female body, not allowed.
Muslims believe the Quran to be the word of God as dictated to the Prophet Muhammad, while most Christians and Jews understand their holy texts to be authored by men inspired by God. This distinction means that critical analysis of the sacred texts, which has so enlightened Christian and Jewish thinking since the 16th century, becomes an extremely sensitive issue when it's applied to the Quran. And it doesn't help when those scholars who are making the attempt are largely Western non-Muslims. Can their studies really shed new light on the text and its origins? In 1972, during the restoration of the Great Mosque of Sana'a, capital of North Yemen, workers discovered a mash of old parchments in a loft between the inner and outer roofs. The entire load was stuffed into some 20 potato sacks, where it might have remained were it not for the arrival 7 years later of Dr. Geert Puin, a German scholar and Quranic expert. Puin immediately grasped the significance of the find. Working with a team of local assistants, he carefully prized the layers apart and fired off thousands of photographs. 4 fragments immediately caught Puin's attention. They contained the first and last chapters of the Quran, and unlike any other Qurans in existence, they were illustrated with architectural drawings of mosques, a vital clue to their origin.
Because of its drawings, because of the art historical context, you can date this Quran very precisely to the time of Al-Walid. This is the reign between 705 and 715.
The oldest datable Quran in the world, created some 70 years after the death of the Prophet. From the potato sacks, Puin identified fragments from nearly 1,000 different Qurans. Comparisons between them and the standard Cairo text in use today are startling. These early texts are written in a kind of shorthand with no vowel markings or distinguishing dots, which means that individual words can have up to 30 different meanings.
Es ist tatsächlich so, dass man durch die schiere Existenz
The sheer existence of so many different possible readings would suggest that this text wasn't passed down word for word.
Der Text eben nicht wortwörtlich überliefert.
The text isn't as stable as it seems in the Cairo version.
In der Fassung von Kairo erscheint.
There was another important discovery amongst the Sana'a fragments. The application of simple forensic techniques revealed earlier texts that had been washed off and overwritten. Although the hidden text revealed no contradictory meanings, words had been changed, verses and whole chapters rearranged.
If his researches are correct, particularly on dating, it suggests, in fact, that the Quran was not a single product, a single entity that was fixed by 650, but actually developed much, much later, hence the overlaying of texts of written materials.
None of this phases Islamic scholars, past and present. They are adamant that the integrity of the text has been preserved through a strong oral tradition, and if differences occur in earlier written versions, they say these are due to regional and colloquial variations of the same words and phrases.
We accept that there is a diversity from the very beginning on very marginal things. It's not changing first the central message of the Quran, the pillars of our faith.
In 2001, another German study caused such outrage that all mention of it was banned in some Islamic countries. A book appeared written by an expert in early Semitic languages. It was so controversial that the author published under a pseudonym and will only speak on condition that his identity remains concealed.
So gesehen ist es unbedingt erforderlich, den Koran neu zu lesen.
In order to understand it correctly, we need a fundamentally new interpretation and reading of the Quran.
Dr. Markus Gross helped to translate the book from its original German into English and is willing, openly, to express the author's views.
Es wurde schon gesagt, 20%. Ich würde sagen, 25%.
About a quarter or a fifth of the Quran contains unintelligible words or words which don't make real sense. That number can be vastly reduced with a knowledge of Syriac to, let's say, 5%.
Syriac, or Syrio-Aramaic, had become one of the dominant languages of Christian liturgy by the 3rd century. Christ spoke Aramaic, and it can still be heard in remote Christian communities like this town of Malula in Syria. But at the time of Muhammad, Syrio-Aramaic was the major written and cultural language of the whole region. Written Arabic was in its infancy.
Wir haben bis zum Koran einige Inschriften.
There are pre-Islamic inscriptions in Arabic, very short texts, but the first real book written in Arabic is the Quran.
But you're saying the Quran is written in 2 languages?
Ja, ich würde sagen, es gibt ja kaum eine Kultursprache.
In many areas in the world, languages mix constantly, all the time.
Denn
to make it understandable to a speaker of English, you have to go back about 1,000 years. Imagine the Anglo-Saxon peasant talking to his master, who was a Norman and spoke a mixed language of French and an Anglo-Saxon. And you could only understand that mixed language with a knowledge of both.
Muslim scholars of the past had the confidence to acknowledge foreign words in the Quran. In the 10th century, Al-Tabari, one of the most respected commentators, identified Hebrew, Latin, Greek, Persian, Abyssinian, and Syriac words. The difference, though, is that Luxembourg is claiming new meanings that have never been suggested before. How can one German professor challenge the collective judgment of more than 1 billion people, and on what basis? What method does he use?
Ich bin natürlich bemüht, zunächst einmal eine arabische Lesung und eine arabische.
Whenever I try to find a solution for an unclear passage, the first step is to try to find an overlooked meaning of an Arabic word which is not used today, but which can be found in old dictionaries, something that the commentators didn't consider. Only if that is not possible, I take into consideration the meaning of the root, of the corresponding root in Syriac, or a possible misreading. Misreading in this case means that the undotted text was dotted wrongly. Then there's also the possibility that a Syriac letter was by mistake written within an Arabic text.
Using these methods, Luxembourg examined some of the most obscure passages of the Quran. After Mary has given birth to Jesus, in the Arabic Quran, the archangel says to her, "Be not sad, your Lord has placed a little river beneath you." In Luxembourg's version, "Be not sad, your Lord has made your delivery legitimate." And there are other highly contentious examples. God's command to a skeptic in Arabic, look at your food and drink, look at your ass, becomes look at your condition and look at your overall state. At the end of the world, the earth steps forward in Arabic. In Syriac, the earth splits open. Plausible to some, but do any of these changes affect the central precepts of Islam? Or is Luxemburg just adding a little poetic color here and there?
Was soziale Gepflogenheiten angeht, wie zum Beispiel...
It's certainly not key precepts like the existence of God or afterlife, which is challenged by my interpretation, but many everyday customs. One example is the veil. The Quranic verse adduced to prove their position talked about humur, which had to be beaten on the pockets. The sentence was a bit obscure. It's usually rendered that it means cover your head and your cleavage. And if you have a look at the chador, the veil in Iran, for example, that's exactly what is covered.
Aramäisch, Gmar, dann verstehe ich ein Gürtel.
But with my Syriac interpretation of the verse, my translation is, put your belt around your hips. And the belt was a sign of chastity, also especially used by monks. So that makes it much more meaningful.
But Luxemburg's interpretation of paradise causes the greatest offense. In the Iranian city of Isfahan, there's a 17th century palace built to represent the gates of heaven. The cool greens of the gardens beyond express the longings of a desert people and are beautifully described in the Koran, along with flowing fountains and the favors of huris, usually understood as wide-eyed virgins. One commentary, but not the Koran, even specifies numbers, 72 for each righteous man. But that doesn't sit well with 7 verses of the Quran that promise the righteous eternal contentment with their wives. Luxemburg believes he has resolved this contradiction.
Mit weiß großäugigen Huris verheiraten.
There is one passage in the Quran dealing with the Huris, in which it says, وَزَوَجْنَاهُمْ بِحُورٍ عِينٍ. We have paired them with dark, wide-eyed maidens. That is the traditional understanding of this verse. If you put the dots on the undotted text a little bit differently, what comes out is, we will make you comfortable under white, crystal-clear grapes.
For the suicide bomber, then, not the prospect of 72 virgins in paradise, but in Luxemburg's interpretation, a modest bunch of grapes.
German study, as far as I'm concerned, is very Christian-centric. It's influenced by the way Bible has been researched and put together. Bible and the Quran are not the same.
It is the connection Luxemburg makes with Christian symbolism that is highly inflammatory to many, but a persuasive argument to others. This 5th century fresco in an Egyptian monastery depicts the archangels receiving souls in paradise. Each archangel holds a grape in one hand and in the other cradles the departed souls, who are refreshed with bunches of grapes. The grape motif is repeated in the vestments of the priests of the Syrian Orthodox Church, all relating back to Christ's promise to his disciples at the Last Supper that he will not drink again of the fruit of the vine until he is reunited with them in his Father's kingdom.
If foreign words were in the Arabic dictionary at the time of the Prophet, surely they had evolved into an Arabic meaning. So that particular word, even if it is Syriac, must be understood in the way the Arabs understood them. Not as grapes, but as hur, partners in heaven.
I think we all understand that it's symbolic, that we have to go beyond the images and the way we look at the paradise, for example. We are not asked to think of this in a literal way. This is what is. We don't know. It's just for us a description of what is going to be beautiful beyond your imagination.
Although Luxemburg's work has been called into question by leading academics and is controversial by its very nature, he believes it opens a door encouraging linguists, archaeologists and historians to use modern tools to throw further light on the text and its context. For some Muslim scholars, that is in the Quranic spirit of free inquiry and no threat to those who are robust in their faith.
This research by Luxembourg and his colleagues doesn't undermine any of the basic tenets, teachings, or principles of Islam. What it does, though, is to provide interesting questions. And we, as thinking Muslims, as people of the 21st century, that we should say, yes, let's look at what he's providing. And let's not just condemn, but let's also see if this research has a historical base, or is it a product of European Orientalism.
The Quran has brought comfort and peace to countless millions. It has given the humblest peasant and laborer a sense of worth and dignity rarely equaled in any other civilization. It has taught people of different races to live in brotherhood and people of different creeds to live side by side in reasonable harmony. It has inspired a great civilization in which Muslims live creative and useful lives and which, by its achievements, enrich the whole world. And it has given clear moral guidance for millions of people to live by.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar.
But when Muslims feel marginalized and threatened, this dignity and courtesy can give way to an explosive mixture of rage and hatred, impelling spokesmen for a great spiritual and ethical religion to seek approval in the Quran for violent confrontation. And this at a time when more Muslims are probably reading and hearing the Quran than in all of previous history. Translations in scores of different languages roll off the press at the rate of millions a year. Electronically sophisticated believers can even access the text in its original Arabic or in translation through the new generation of electronic Qurans. But modern technology has also given tremendous power and scope to those determined to impose their own interpretations on the Quran.
We Muslims have been ordered to do brainwashing.
Scores of satellite channels compete for the attention of Muslims across the world. And in the battle of the airwaves, those who shout the loudest have the edge.
وأسأل الله أن يرد كيد الكائدين وأن يدمر اليهود ومن عاونهم من النصارى.
Now, of course, the latest technology is the internet, which is a very important platform for the spread of sort of fundamentalist types of religion. It's depressing to see how profoundly a religion's temper can be shaped simply by purely technological developments, but that is one of the things that's happening at the moment.
The internet has become the chosen forum of radicals and extremists. On this site, Mohammed Siddiq Khan posts his own obituary prior to the 7/7 London bombing, where he played the key role.
We are at war and I'm a soldier. Now you too will taste the reality of this situation.
The cumulative effect of all this propaganda can only be guessed at. But what is certain is that there have been radical changes in the way some men and women believe they should live their lives according to the Quran, turning a great city like Cairo into a place that would be unrecognizable to anyone returning here after an absence of only 30 years.
Up until 1974, I had not seen a single veiled woman.
If the veil is worn, it must cover the face and hide the beauty.
But it's not just a question of interpretation. Sometimes those who shout the loudest are guilty of willful misreading of the text, ignoring, for instance, the firm injunctions in the Quran to forgive any wrongdoer who sincerely repents. or claiming Quranic approval for ancient cultural practices that anyone reading the text with a clear eye would know to be contrary to the message of the Quran.
It is an African cultural practice. It harms a female body. It's mutilating a female body. Not allowed.
But, and this is hardest, there are verses which, if read in isolation, are deeply troubling to the modern conscience, particularly verses referring to women. Yet for every reference that seems to confirm their inferior status, there are others calling for mutual respect and equality.
The Quran honors women. The Quran dignifies women. I feel that as a woman every day.
And that's the paradox of the Quran. It speaks to Muhammad's 7th century tribal audience, and it speaks to a 21st century worldwide audience. It offers challenges and choices, not dictums. But if read carefully, one consistent message comes through. Think and think again.
The Quran is telling you, go and look and study and understand and try to change for the better. You are here as reformists. You have to reform yourself, your heart and the world for the better. This is the way the Quran should be in your life, a companion, a light, and helping you to be creative.
To explore the diversity of Islamic culture, go to channel4.com/searching. And tonight on 4 from 12:10, catch the new series of Sharia TV.